Good day and welcome to Space Station Live for Monday, August 5th, 2013. You are inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, where the Orbit 2 team is on console, watching over the activities of the half-dozen humans on the orbital outpost comprising the Expedition 36 crew. On console at this hour, Flight Director Richard Jones is presiding over the activities on board the International Space Station on the right side of your screen. To his left in the middle is astronaut Anna Fisher, who is the communications link between the flight control team here in Houston and the crew members on board the orbital laboratory. The 6 crew members on board, led by Commander Pavel Vinogradov, are split into basically 2 teams who arrived at separate times in their respective Soyuz vehicles. From left to right, flight engineer Alexander Mazurkin, Vinogradov, and NASA's Chris Cassidy, who launched to the International Space Station on their Soyuz vehicle from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan back on March 29th. They were joined 2 months later by the other trio on board the complex, flight engineer Karen Nyberg of NASA, Russian cosmonaut Fyodor Yurchikhin, and European Space Agency astronaut Luca Parmitano. Those 3 arrived on board the International Space Station on May 29th. That trio is currently in the midst of their 69th day in space. The Cassidy, Mazurkin, and Vinogradov trio in their 130th day in orbit. This week in the life of the International Space Station began on the southern coast of Japan on Saturday when a Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency H-2B rocket rolled out to its Oceanside launch pad and went through the final preparations for launching the HTV-4, the Kanatori 4 vehicle, the Japanese resupply craft that is currently en route to the International Space Station. A flawless countdown after the vehicle was fueled resulted in the engines and the solid rocket boosters igniting at 2:48 and 46 seconds p.m. Central Time on Saturday, which was 4:48 and 46 seconds a.m. Japan time on Sunday morning. The rise to orbit arcing out actually over the southeast was picture perfect. The solid rocket boosters firing in concert with the 2 engines comprising the first stage of the H-2B rocket. The solid rocket boosters burning out 2 minutes into the flight. They were jettisoned, followed about a minute and a half later by the jettisoning of the fairing that enshrouded the HTV-4 cargo ship, the unpiloted cargo ship that is currently en route to the International Space Station. The first stage engine cut off at about the 5-minute 46-second mark into the flight. The first and second stages of the H-2B rocket separated, and the second stage engine ignited just seconds later and burned for about 8 minutes and 10 seconds to finally place the HTV-4 vehicle into its preliminary orbit and to begin a 6-day chase to catch up to the International Space Station. Ironically, at the time that the HTV-4 was placed into its preliminary orbit, the International Space Station flew directly overhead over the Tanegashima Space Center in southern Japan, from where the HTV-4 left just a few minutes earlier. Since launch, a series of rendezvous burns have been successfully executed to fine-tune the path of the HTV-4 cargo ship to the International Space Station. Additional engine firings and mid-course correction burns are on tap for the remainder of the week, setting up the HTV for its arrival at the International Space Station on Friday morning. The HTV is loaded with 3.6 tons of cargo. Involved in that cargo complement, some 4,094 pounds of dry cargo, spare parts, and experiment hardware, some 1,257 pounds of water, and 24 contingency water bags. That cargo is housed inside the HTV itself, known as pressurized cargo. Then outside on what is known as the exposed pallet in a slot in the HTV vehicle is external cargo, a 516-pound main bus switching unit for the station's power supply on board the International Space Station, a 644-pound utility transfer assembly, integrated assembly. That's basically a an electronics assembly for the Solar Alpha rotary joint on the International Space Station, and a 721-pound experiment called the Space Test Program 4 for the Department of Defense. All of that hardware housed on the exposed pallet that will be extracted from the side slot on the HTV itself on Sunday and installed after a handoff to the Japanese robotic arm. It will be installed on the porch of the Kibo module, where the experiments will be plucked out of that pallet one by one and installed on the exposed facility, the experiment platform on the outside of the Kibo module. The rendezvous burns that will eventually lead up to and include the grapple of the HTV for its berthing on the Earth-facing side of Harmony will result in the HTV approaching the International Space Station from below along what is known as the radial vector, or R-bar, directly below the station at a point at about 35 feet away. Astronauts Karen Nyberg and Chris Cassidy, operating from the robotics workstation in the cupola, will reach out and grapple the barrel-like HTV cargo ship, maneuver it in place, and slowly inch its way toward a common berthing mechanism, a docking mechanism, if you will, on the Earth-facing side of the Harmony connecting module on the International Space Station. Once it is in place, then commanding of bolting will take place with first and second stage capture to follow. The second stage capture actually representing the formal mating of the HTV to the International Space Station and a month-long stay on the International Outpost for the unloading of its equipment. On September 4th, the HTV will be unberthed and discarded, loaded with trash, for a fiery reentry back into the Earth's atmosphere, where it will burn up over the Pacific Ocean. To that end, Nyberg, Chris Cassidy, and Luca Parmitano have been rehearsing grapple procedures today using the station's robotic arm, the Canadarm2, again operating out of the cupola on the International Space Station. Parmitano will be responsible for monitoring the systems on the HTV as it makes its glacial approach toward its grapple by Nyberg and Cassidy. Here is a view, in fact, of Chris Cassidy inside the cupola at the robotics workstation, where he and Nyberg have been rehearsing what they call offset grapple procedures, a variety of fine-tuned techniques to make sure that they have the proficiency that they need on Friday to reach out and grab onto the HTV with the Canadarm2. Also involved today, more activity with Robonaut, the humanoid robot that has been operating remotely from the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Robonaut has been working with a task board in Destiny in this so-called teleops that result in more data collection about the operation of a robot from ground controllers back on Earth. And on the Russian segment of the International Space Station, cosmonauts Fyodor Yurchikhin and Alexander Mazurkin began work with their Russian Orlan spacesuits as they prepare for a pair of spacewalks outside the Pirs docking compartment on August 16th and 22nd to continue to deploy experiments and connect cables in preparation for the launch of a Russian laboratory module later this year. That's a glimpse of what's going on today aboard the International Space Station.